The letter arrived on Ethan Cross's 35th birthday, wedged between a disconnection notice from the electric company and a final demand from Jessica's divorce attorney. He sat in his 2008 Ford pickup outside a Portland strip mall, engine off to save gas, watching Sophie sleep in the back seat with her threadbare stuffed bear clutched tight against her chest. 3 months since the divorce. 2 months since Pacific Northwest Construction went under. 1 month since they'd started living in the truck. The envelope from Baker and Associates, Clearwater, Montana, felt thick, official, impossible. Inside, documents stamped with county seals, a property deed, a cover letter explaining that Thomas and Rose Brennan, grandparent as Ethan barely remembered, had died and left him 400 acres called Thunder Ridge Ranch. The words blurred as exhaustion hit him. 35 years old, a carpenter with no contracts, a father with $847, and a daughter who deserved better than gym showers and library bathrooms. The ranch sat in a state he'd left 20 years ago, torn from the only home he'd known by social workers who'd promised his grandparents were too old, too unfit, too dangerous to raise a grieving 8-year-old. He'd believed them. He'd hated Thomas and Rose Brennan for letting him go without a fight. Sophie stirred, blinking awake. Her voice came small. "Do we have to go back to the library today? We might not have to go anywhere for a while, baby." Her face lit up with hope that made his chest ache. Baker's office occupied the ground floor of a building that smelled like old money and older grudges. The attorney himself, 60-something, Brooks Brothers suit, cufflinks that caught the light, looked Ethan and Sophie over with the expression of a man examining something unfortunate his dog had dragged in. Ethan's Carhartt jacket bore sawdust and oil stains. Sophie's dress came from Goodwill, 2 sizes salvaged and safety pinned at the hem. Baker gestured toward leather chairs they were clearly meant to feel unworthy of. The paperwork took 20 minutes. Signatures, initials, dates. Baker's pen scratched across pages with the sound of finality. Then he leaned back, fingers steepled, and delivered what he clearly considered pragmatic advice. "Mr. Cross, I must be frank. Thunder Ridge Ranch has been essentially abandoned for 15 years. The structures are unsound. The land is overgrown. Your grandparents, God rest them, ceased all maintenance activities in their final years. The property requires, conservative estimate, $500,000 in restoration work. You're a carpenter, an unemployed carpenter with a dependent child. Whitmore Development has offered $200,000 for the entire parcel. Given your circumstances, accepting that offer would be the sensible course." Sophie's hand found his. Her grip tightened as Baker continued. "They've been trying to acquire that land for over a decade. Senator Whitmore personally authorized the offer. It's generous considering the condition. I've seen the inspection reports. You'd need heavy equipment just to make the house habitable. The barn's half collapsed. Fencing is gone. This isn't a weekend project, Mr. Cross. This is a money pit you can't afford." Something in the man's tone, the practiced dismissal, the assumption of incompetence, sparked anger Ethan hadn't felt in months. He'd spent 20 years building things with his hands, framing houses, raising walls, creating shelter where none existed. This attorney knew nothing about him except his bank balance and current address, yet spoke as if those metrics defined the sum of his capabilities. "I'll need to see the property first." His voice came steady, surprising himself. Baker's expression soured. "Of course. But when you realize the scope of what you're facing, my office will facilitate the sale to Whitmore Development. The offer expires in 30 days. I'd advise against wasting time on false hopes." Outside, Sophie tugged his sleeve. Why was that man so mean? "Some people think money makes them better than everyone else, baby. They're wrong." The second envelope had been tucked inside the first, smaller, hand-addressed in shaky cursive, that must have cost Rose Brennan tremendous effort near the end. Ethan opened it, sitting in the truck, while Sophie colored in a donated activity book, and the words rewrote everything he'd believed about his childhood. The letter explained in his grandmother's failing script that they'd never abandoned him, that court orders and threats had silenced them, that Thomas had discovered something terrible on the ranch, and powerful people had weaponized social services to tear their family apart. The drive took 9 hours through mountains and high desert, across state lines and time zones, following a GPS track into territory Ethan's memory rendered in fragments. By the time they turned onto the dirt road marked Thunder Ridge Ranch, private property, sunset was painting the Montana sky in shades of amber and rust. The ranch materialized like a broken promise. Structures that had once meant safety reduced to weathered bones against endless grassland. The main house sagged under a failing roof, white paint peeling in long curls to expose gray wood beneath. Windows gaped empty or boarded over. The wraparound porch listed dangerously, columns cracked and rails hanging loose. The barn's red paint had weathered to bare timber, its northwest corner collapsed inward where the roof had given way. Outbuildings stood in various states of surrender, a tool shed with no roof, a chicken coop leaning 30 degrees off vertical, a garage with rust-frozen doors hanging open on emptiness. Sage and wildgrass had reclaimed everything in a riot of green that made the decay somehow worse. Nature indifferent to human failure. Sophie pressed against the window, eyes wide. "This is ours?" The question hit harder than she'd meant. "Yeah, baby, this is home." The lie tasted bitter but necessary. Inside smelled of abandonment, dust and mildew and time's slow rot. Furniture crouched under yellowed sheets. On the mantel, family photographs watched through dusty glass. Thomas and Rose, young and strong, a wedding portrait from another era. In one frame Ethan had to lift and wipe clean to recognize himself. 8 years old, flanked by grandparents who smiled with unguarded joy. The last moment before social workers arrived and everything shattered. The kitchen still held dishes in the sink, fossilized by decades. Rose's apron hung on its hook, fabric faded but somehow still carrying the ghost of her presence. Down the hall, 3 bedrooms waited in various states of preservation. His old room stopped him in the doorway. Bed, toys, drawings on the walls, all frozen exactly as he'd left them. A shrine to a childhood interrupted. Sophie explored with quiet wonder, touching the carved wooden animals on the shelf, picking up books whose pages had yellowed with waiting. "Ba lived here?" Her voice held awe. "For 6 months, after my parents died. These were the happiest months I had left." The admission hurt to voice. "Why did Ba leave?" "Bad people made him." He crouched to her level, gripping her shoulders. "But we're not leaving now. No matter what happens, we're not leaving, okay?" She nodded, solemn, trusting. "Okay, Ba." The study door at the hall's end was locked with hardware different from every other room. The key from Baker's office turned smoothly in the front door. The bedrooms, the closets, but not this lock. Ethan tried anyway, knowing it was futile, remembering Rose's letter about hiding places and treasure hunts. His grandfather had loved puzzles, loved teaching Ethan to think sideways, to see what others missed. Hollowed books, he'd said, false bottoms, compartments built into plain sight. The living room shelves held hundreds of volumes, spines sun-faded and dust-caked. Ethan started pulling them down, checking weights, riffling pages. Sophie helped without being asked, creating organized stacks, wiping covers clean. An hour passed. Then Sophie reached the top shelf and pulled down a leather-bound copy of Treasure Island that felt wrong in her small hands. "Bah, this one's light." The pages had been carved out with surgical precision, creating a hollow space lined with felt. Inside, a brass key attached to a note in Thomas's distinctive hand. The words made Ethan's throat close. "For Ethan, when he comes home. Truth is in the study. Be careful, son. Some secrets are kept for good reasons. Some because powerful people wanted them hidden. What you find in that room cost us you, but might also lead to justice for people waiting a long time for someone to care enough to look. Trust your instincts. Know everything we did because we loved you more than our own safety." The key turned smoothly. The door swung inward on hinges someone had maintained even as the rest of the house crumbled. The overhead light flickered once, twice, then held steady, revealing what Thomas Brennan had spent a decade building while his heart broke from missing his grandson. Every wall was covered, maps marked with colored pins, red for incident locations, blue for connected individuals, yellow for the missing. 23 yellow pins, each bearing a name and photograph. Newspaper clippings overlapped police reports, overlapped property records, overlapped surveillance photographs. Red yarn connected points in a web of conspiracy that spanned the room. Filing cabinets lined one wall, drawers labeled by year. A desk dominated the center, buried under notebooks filled with Thomas's meticulous handwriting, evidence catalogs, cross-references that must have taken years to compile. This wasn't a study. This was a war room. This was what happened when one man refused to stop fighting even after they'd taken away everything he loved. Sophie's small voice barely registered. What is this place? Ung was investigating something, baby. Something, Bem. Something that he looked at the yellow pins, the missing faces, the timeline stretching back 30 years. Something that took a lot of people away from their families. Did he find them? Ethan lifted the first notebook, dated 1995. I don't know yet, but I'm going to read everything he wrote and find out. The entries began mundane, ranch business, weather observations, notes about an 8-year-old grandson settling in after tragedy. Then March 14, 1995, found something disturbing north pasture near Devil's Creek today. Ground disturbance, fresh, professional, not surveyors, not animals. Purpose unclear but wrong. Marked location, photographed, installed cameras. The investigation spiraled from there with the methodical precision of someone who understood evidence chains and burden of proof. Within weeks, Thomas had captured night footage of men with equipment, vehicles without plates, coordinated operations that vanished before dawn. He'd started asking questions in Clearwater, carefully, and learned other ranchers had noticed similar activity but been dismissed by law enforcement. The notebooks detailed months of research into property records, shell companies purchasing land and patterns that surrounded the ranch like a noose. Thomas had discovered disappearances, 23 spanning 3 decades, all classified as runaways or accidents, numbers far too high for a rural area. He tried reporting everything to state police, FBI, journalists. Every avenue had terminated in dead ends or active obstruction. 5 days before social services arrived, his handwriting grew urgent. They know house searched while Rose and Ethan in town, papers disturbed. They know I have evidence, afraid not for myself but for Rose and especially Ethan. If they disappear people to protect secrets, what will they do to an old rancher? Ethan is leverage. As long as he's with us, they can threaten him. Have to let him go to keep him alive. We'll preserve evidence. Wait. Hope he returns when safe. Ethan's hands shook, holding the notebook. Sophie had fallen asleep on the couch, wrapped in a blanket from the truck. 1 a.m. had become 2, then 3. His grandparents hadn't abandoned him. They'd sacrificed him to save him, then spent 20 years maintaining this room, this evidence, this proof, while living with the knowledge that he believed they hadn't wanted him. The grief was physical, a weight pressing his lungs, a blade behind his ribs. 20 years of resentment for people who'd loved him more than their own happiness. Dawn found him hollow and certain. The yellow pins on the map weren't just names. They were daughters, sons, futures erased. 23 families living with the same unknowing he'd carried, except their loved ones were actually gone, not just separated. Thomas had built a case strong enough to prosecute. He'd documented patterns, preserved evidence, cross-referenced decades of crimes. He'd been 5 days from presenting everything to authorities when they'd shut him down by weaponizing the system against him. 20 years later, his grandson held the same evidence and faced the same question. Stay safe or finish the fight. Sophie woke hungry. The drive to Clearwater revealed a town that watched strangers with mountain suspicion. Tilly's Diner provided pancakes at $18 Ethan couldn't afford not to spend. The waitress, Marge, according to her name tag, smiled with practiced warmth while other patrons studied them with unconcealed interest. A rancher named Pete Simmons approached with condolences about Thomas and advice about accepting Whitmore Development's offer. Everyone seemed to know about the offer. Everyone seemed to assume Ethan would take it and disappear back to wherever broken people went when Montana was done with them. The general store took another 187 from his dwindling funds. Water, basic food, camping supplies, flashlights, first aid kit. The cashier made the same suggestion about Whitmore's generosity. Ethan managed something polite and non-committal. In the truck, Sophie asked why everyone wanted them to sell, and he explained that small towns had long memories and longer loyalties, and sometimes those loyalties didn't align with justice. Back at the ranch, his phone, one bar of signal, barely functional, delivered a voicemail from Portland, another construction company, declining his application. That made 40 rejections in 60 days. His bank account showed $829 between survival and catastrophe. The conservative estimate of $500,000 to restore the ranch suddenly felt optimistic. Whitmore's $200,000 could solve every immediate problem, fund a fresh start somewhere employment existed. It would also mean walking away from 23 families who deserved answers and one old man who'd bet everything that his grandson would care enough to finish what he'd started. The decision crystallized standing in Thomas's war room, Sophie's drawings from her old bedroom now pinned beside the evidence. We stay. The words felt like commitment and foolishness in equal measure. The afternoon vanished into research. Ethan had what Thomas lacked 20 years ago: internet access, public databases, cross-reference tools. He pulled up Montana's construction permit records and missing persons databases simultaneously. Within an hour, a pattern emerged that made his hands go cold. Every disappearance occurred within 60 to 90 days before a major construction project completed. Jenny Martinez vanished June 1977, Highway 89 widening, finished August. Kyle Thompson disappeared March 1982, Clearwater Bridge repair done May. 23 victims, 23 construction projects. Excavations, foundations, underground work, all completed shortly after people went missing. The construction companies were subsidiaries of Whitmore Development Group, every single one. Senator Marcus Whitmore's personal empire. The method became horrifyingly clear. They weren't just near construction sites, they were in them, buried in excavations before concrete poured, before asphalt was laid, before foundations set. Evidence sealed under Montana's infrastructure, requiring the destruction of highways and bridges and buildings to recover. Genius and evil in equal measure. Thomas had been close to understanding this but lacked digital tools to connect the final dots. Ethan had found the missing piece in 3 hours of internet research, and the weight of that discovery sat like lead in his gut. A truck approached while he was creating spreadsheets from 30 years of tragedy. The engine sound was different from local vehicles. Well-maintained, confident. Through the window, a Dodge Ram, maybe 2010, pulling up without hesitation. The man who emerged moved with the bearing of someone accustomed to respect and competent to demand it. Late 60s, gray-haired, work clothes that had seen actual work, a face weathered by Montana winters and something harder than weather. The introduction came direct. Jack Morrison, retired FBI, local carpenter, someone who'd known Thomas Brennan and failed him when it mattered. He spoke of regret and case files shut down from Washington, of evidence he'd preserved against orders, of debts carried 2 decades. He looked at the sagging house and offered materials, expertise, labor, and partnership in whatever came next. Why would you risk it? The question demanded honesty. Jack's answer came without hesitation. Because I watched the system destroy a good man 20 years ago and did nothing effective to stop it. Because you're here with your daughter trying to do right by your grandfather's memory, and I won't fail Thomas's family twice. Because taking down corrupt politicians is every agent's dream retirement project, and I'm bored as hell in my cabin. The study reveal made Jack go silent. He studied the walls with an expression somewhere between horror and professional admiration. This is better than 90% of FBI cases I worked. Tom went deep. Obsessive, careful, brilliant. He scanned the notebooks, the evidence catalog, the cross-references. When Ethan showed him the construction burial method spreadsheet, Jack's jaw set. He didn't have these tools. You found what he couldn't. This plus everything he documented. We can prosecute, but not through Montana. Totally compromised. We need federal prosecutor outside the state. I know someone. Sarah Bennett, assistant U.S. attorney in Portland. Oregon office, clean record. 1 cases against officials who thought themselves untouchable. The partnership formed over instant coffee at the ruined kitchen table. 2 tracks, rebuild the ranch while building the case. Make the property defensible. Establish legitimacy as residents. Appear harmless to anyone watching. simultaneously organize evidence with FBI standards, create prosecution packages, prepare for the moment when going official would make Ethan a target. 4 to 6 weeks minimum before contacting Sarah. Time to make the house livable, time to structure the case, time to prepare for the war that would follow. Sophie trusted Jack immediately in the way children sometimes recognize good people beneath surface presentations. When he showed her how to hold a hammer properly, explaining leverage and follow-through, she listened with focus Ethan rarely saw in her. When Jack mentioned his late wife had been a teacher and how much she would have liked Sophie's drawings, the girl beamed with pleasure that made Ethan's chest ache. The first week passed in physical labor that felt like therapy. Jack arrived each dawn with supplies salvaged from completed projects: lumber, shingles, windows, tools. They started with the roof, stripping damaged sections and replacing them panel by panel. The work was hard, hot, endless. Ethan's carpentry skills translated well enough, though Jack's experience showed in every efficient motion. Sophie helped at ground level, fetching tools, organizing materials, learning measurements through practical application. Evenings meant evidence work, digitizing notebooks, scanning documents, building databases, cross-referencing decades of information with modern software. Jack brought his FBI experience to bear, organizing everything prosecution ready: timelines, witness lists, evidence chains, legal frameworks. They identified 3 former Whitmore development workers who might testify if offered protection: Doug Carver, Maria Crawford, Kenny Wilson. Jack's old contacts began quiet outreach, gauging willingness, assessing reliability. The ranch transformed incrementally. New roof sections gleamed against old. Windows went from boarded darkness to cautious transparency. The porch regained structural integrity. Sophie's bedroom became livable: clean walls, functioning window, space heater for cold nights. Small victories accumulating toward habitability. The tire tracks appeared on day 12. Ethan was hauling debris near the property line when he noticed them. Fresh impressions in soft earth where vehicles had no legitimate reason to be. The pattern suggested someone had driven from the old access road connecting to Shell Company land, circled the house at distance, then returned. Recent enough that weather hadn't eroded the marks. Professional enough to stay just outside camera range if they'd thought to install cameras. Jack studied the tracks with an expression Ethan had learned meant concern masked as analysis. Expected this. When you claim the inheritance, they noticed. Now they're assessing whether you're a threat or just another broke carpenter trying to salvage an inheritance. We need to install security before they decide you're the former. The camera system went up that afternoon, 6 units covering approaches, motion activated, wireless linked to a laptop monitoring station Jack configured in the study. Perimeter sensors covered gaps, trip alarms at key points. The ranch became fortress in waiting while maintaining the appearance of renovation project. They kept working visible exterior repairs during daylight, maintaining the fiction that Ethan was merely fixing his inheritance, not investigating conspiracy. The visitor arrived on day 15 without warning. An SUV, expensive, clean, wrong for ranch country, pulled up mid-morning while Jack was in Clearwater, buying supplies, and Sophie was practicing multiplication at the kitchen table. The man who emerged wore business casual that screamed money and influence. 50-something, confident, stride, smile that never touched his eyes. Daniel Reeves, according to his introduction, representing Senator Whitmore and Whitmore Development Group. He'd heard Ethan was settling in, wanted to reiterate that the purchase offer remained on the table. $200,000 for property that needed $500,000 in work. He left without waiting for response, SUV kicking up dust that hung in the still air like a question mark. Sophie moved close. "Bah, why did that man say mean things about our house?" "Because some people want things that aren't theirs, baby, and they don't like being told no. But we're not leaving, remember? No matter what." The certainty in his own voice surprised him. 20 years ago, powerful people had taken everything from Thomas Brennan. They'd weaponized the system, silenced investigation, and made a little boy believe his grandparents hadn't loved him. They'd buried 23 people under Montana's infrastructure and called it economic development. They'd thought themselves untouchable because money and influence had always meant immunity. But Thomas had built a case. Ethan had found the missing pieces. Jack brought federal resources and prosecution contacts. Sophie gave him a reason beyond justice, a future that demanded fighting for. And somewhere in Portland, an assistant U.S. attorney named Sarah Bennett was about to receive the most comprehensive corruption case she'd ever seen. The sunset painted Thunder Ridge Ranch in amber light, new roof sections contrasting with old, windows reflecting sky instead of emptiness, daughter humming while she colored at a table in a house that was slowly remembering how to be a home. The evidence sat organized and digitized in a study that had waited 20 years for this moment. Somewhere out there, powerful people were deciding how to handle the problem of Ethan Cross. Let them come. Let them try. This time the fight would finish different. Sometimes the only way to honor the dead is to finish their unfinished work. Thomas Brennan had understood that. He'd built something that mattered knowing he might never see justice delivered. He'd preserved truth in a room locked with love and hope, and the desperate belief that someday, somehow, his grandson would care enough to complete what he'd started. Ethan stood in that room now. Sophie safe in the house, Thomas had kept waiting, evidence ready to unleash, and the certainty settling in his bones. They took 20 years. They don't get 20 more. Jack's truck returned at dusk carrying plumbing supplies and news that 3 potential witnesses had agreed to preliminary conversations. The laptop in the study showed motion sensor activity, vehicles passing on the access road at intervals suggesting surveillance patterns. The pieces were moving. The war was coming. And for the first time since the divorce, since unemployment, since living in his truck with his daughter, Ethan Cross felt something other than defeat settling in his chest. Purpose. Legacy. The spine-deep knowledge that some inheritances aren't measured in acres or dollars, but in the courage to stand when standing watched everything. The first stars appeared over Montana grassland as father and daughter and former FBI agent ate simple dinner at a table that had witnessed decades of family meals. Tomorrow they'd strip more damaged siding. Tomorrow they'd digitize more evidence. Tomorrow they'd take another step toward the moment when $200,000 worth of silence met 20 years worth of truth, and Montana would learn what happened when ordinary people refused to accept that power equaled immunity. Thomas Brennan's war room waited in the dark, maps and evidence preserved, yellow pins marking faces that deserved justice, red yarn connecting conspiracy threads that would unravel if pulled correctly. 400 acres of broken ranch stood ready to become fortress, home, and proving ground. One 8-year-old girl slept secure for the first time in months, dreaming of a future her father was determined to make real. And in Portland, Sarah Bennett's office would soon receive a package that would make her reconsider everything she thought she knew about corruption's reach and one retired FBI agent's definition of unfinished business. The fight was coming. Let it come. The plumbing fought them for 3 days straight. Pipes frozen solid from 15 winters burst the moment heat and pressure returned, spraying rust-colored water across walls Sophie had just finished priming. Jack cursed with the fluency of a man who'd spent 4 decades negotiating with stubborn materials, while Ethan learned that carpentry skills translate poorly to the dark art of resurrecting dead water systems. By the 3rd afternoon, they'd replaced 60 feet of copper, installed new fixtures scavenged from Jack's seemingly infinite supply stash, and discovered the well pump worked fine once cleared of debris and mouse nests. Sophie celebrated the first functioning shower in weeks by staying under the spray until the hot water ran cold, emerging pink-faced and grinning. Her hair, washed properly for the first time since Portland, hung in damp curls while she practiced writing her name on steamed bathroom mirrors. Small victories accumulated like compound interest. The kitchen sink drained, the toilet flushed. The ancient water heater coughed to life after Jack replaced its corroded heating element with parts ordered overnight from Billings. Evenings belonged to Thomas's evidence. The dining room table, stripped, sanded, refinished by Sophie's careful hands under Jack's patient instruction, became their operations center. Laptop screens glowed with scanned documents, while Jack's FBI training shaped raw information into prosecutable structure. Witness statements from Doug Carver arrived via encrypted email, his voice recorded describing how Whitmore development crews had dug deeper than blueprints specified, how sealed containers disappeared into excavations before concrete trucks arrived. Maria Crawford's testimony came next, detailing the night Senator Whitmore himself visited a construction site and emerged from a private trailer looking shaken, how she'd been offered $5,000 to forget whatever she hadn't seen. Kenny Wilson proved harder to reach. Jack's contacts reported the retired foreman had gone silent after initial willingness, neighbors mentioning black SUVs parked outside his Billings apartment for 3 consecutive nights. The message was clear enough: cooperate and face consequences. Jack made notes about protective custody requirements in federal witness protocols, building files that assumed Sarah Bennett would greenlight full prosecution. The ranch transformed in visible increments. New siding covered the south wall where rot had penetrated deepest. The porch gained railings that didn't wobble under weight. Windows throughout the house transitioned from boarded darkness to actual glass, letting Montana sunlight flood rooms that had existed in perpetual twilight. Sophie claimed her old room as territory worth defending, covering walls with drawings that showed the house in progressive states of repair, broken to fixed, rendered in crayon optimism that made grown men's throats tight. Jack worked with the efficiency of someone who'd rebuilt more than houses in his 70 years. His hands moved with practiced certainty, measuring twice, cutting once, teaching Ethan shortcuts that saved hours. But the teaching extended beyond carpentry. He showed Sophie how to read levels and squares, how wood grain indicated strength or weakness, how buildings spoke if you learned their language. Watching them work together, weathered FBI veteran, an 8-year-old girl, reminded Ethan that inheritance came in forms beyond property deeds and genetic material. The surveillance intensified on day 22. Motion sensors logged vehicles on the access road at predictable intervals: dawn, noon, dusk. Professional patterns, someone tracking their routines, cataloging when they worked outside versus inside, noting Jack's truck arrivals and departures. The cameras Jack installed captured distant shapes, too far for identification, but close enough to confirm Ethan's growing certainty that powerful people were deciding how to handle the problem of Thomas Brennan's grandson. Doug Carver's second statement arrived with an addendum that made Jack's expression harden. The former equipment operator had been visited by men claiming to represent an insurance company, asking questions about old injuries, implying his disability benefits might face a review if he cooperated with federal investigations. Maria Crawford reported similar pressure, casual mentions of her daughter's upcoming college applications, how unfortunate it would be if certain background checks revealed complications. The threats came wrapped in plausible deniability, soft-voiced implications from people who smiled while destroying lives. Jack cataloged each incident with methodical fury. This is what we're up against. They've been doing this 30 years, perfecting intimidation into an art form. They don't need violence when they can threaten your livelihood, your family's future, everything you've built. That's why Thomas couldn't win alone. That's why we need federal protection for these witnesses before they're scared silent. The call to Sarah Bennett happened on day 24, Jack's voice steady through the encrypted line while Ethan listened on speaker. Sarah, Jack Morrison, need to discuss a case. Major, multi-decade conspiracy involving murder, corruption, and a sitting U.S. senator. Evidence is extensive. Witnesses are willing but need protection. And we need to move fast. Elections in 8 months. And if this man becomes governor, prosecution becomes infinitely harder. Her response came cautious but interested. Jack, if this is about Montana politics, why come to Portland? Because everyone in Montana who could investigate is either compromised, intimidated, or dead. We need someone outside the state with resources and authority to move independent of local pressure. That's you. The meeting was set for Saturday morning at a coffee shop on Hawthorne Avenue, 3 days away. Ethan marked the date with relief and dread in equal measure. Relief that action was finally possible. Dread at making himself an official target. Sophie found the second key on the day 26, purely by accident. She'd been exploring the barn's intact section, now cleared of debris and reinforced with Jack's engineering, when a loose board revealed a metal box welded to the understructure. Inside, USB drives labeled by year, Thomas's backup system in case the house evidence was compromised. The drives contained everything from the study, plus additional materials, Audio recordings of phone conversations with uncooperative officials, video surveillance of nighttime activities on ranch property, financial records showing shell company transactions. Thomas had been thorough beyond measure, anticipating every possible loss, protecting information like it was Sophie herself. Jack copied the drives immediately, creating multiple backups distributed to safe deposit boxes across 3 states. The redundancy felt paranoid until Ethan remembered how Thomas's FBI reports had been intercepted, how journalists had been warned off, how every legitimate channel had closed. Paranoia became prudence when the enemy controlled infrastructure. The transformation inside the house paralleled external repairs. The kitchen became functional, appliances resurrected or replaced, cabinets refinished, counters cleaned to original butcher block beauty. The living room furniture emerged from under sheets and decades of dust, revealing pieces Rose had clearly loved. A handmade quilt, photographs in frames crafted by Thomas's skilled hands, a rocking chair that creaked with memories of motion. Sophie adopted the rocker as a reading spot, curling up with Laura Ingalls Wilder books from the town library, acting out pioneer life in a ranch that was itself being pioneered back from abandonment. Daniel Reeves returned on day 28, his SUV arriving mid-afternoon when Jack was pressure washing the porch and Sophie was supposed to be napping, but was actually building a fort from couch cushions. The man emerged carrying a briefcase this time, his expression suggesting business rather than threat assessment. Ethan met him at the bottom of the porch steps, blocking access, making clear this conversation would happen outside. Reeves smiled with practiced warmth. "Mr. Cross, I'm glad you're still here. Shows character, determination. The senator admires that, which is why he's authorized me to make a revised offer." He opened the briefcase to reveal papers and what looked like a cashier's check. $5 million, no questions, no contingencies. You sign over the property, we handle all transfer costs, and you and your daughter start over anywhere you want with enough money to make that fresh start count. The number hit like physical impact, $5 million. Enough to never worry about money again. College fund for Sophie, security for decades. Everything the divorce and unemployment had stolen, returned with interest that could buy any life they wanted. But Ethan had spent 28 days reading his grandfather's pain, organizing evidence of 23 murdered people, watching his daughter learn to trust that home meant something permanent. The number was large because the desperation behind it was larger. Not interested. His voice came flat, final. Reeves's smile never wavered. "Mr. Cross, be reasonable. $5 million. You're living in a half-renovated house with $800 in your account. Yes, we checked. Raising a daughter who deserves better than this. The senator is being generous because he respects your grandfather's memory, wants to end this amicably. But this offer expires in 48 hours. After that, things become less friendly." Sophie appeared in the doorway, drawn by voices. Reeves's attention shifted to her with calculation that made Ethan's hands curl into fists. Think about her future, about what kind of father prioritizes stubborn pride over his daughter's security and safety. The words triggered something primal. Ethan closed the distance between them in 2 steps, grabbed Reeves by his expensive jacket, slammed him against the SUV hard enough to dent metal. "Don't you dare talk about my daughter. Don't you dare pretend this is about her safety when your boss has been murdering people and burying them under highways for 30 years. We found the pattern. We have witnesses. We have evidence. And in 3 days, a federal prosecutor sees everything." Reeves didn't struggle, but his expression shifted from performance to genuine threat. "You just made a serious mistake. The senator tried being reasonable, tried giving you a way out. But if you're choosing war, understand what that means. We have resources you can't imagine. Connections that reach everywhere. Your grandfather learned that lesson. I'd hoped you were smarter." Ethan released him, stepping back, hands shaking with adrenaline. "Get off my property. Tell your senator his money doesn't buy silence this time. Tell him his days of hiding behind power are ending." Reeves straightened his jacket with deliberate care, retrieved his briefcase, climbed into his SUV without rush. 48 hours, Mr. Cross. After that, consequences are on you." He drove away slowly, tires crunching gravel, leaving silence that felt like the space between lightning and thunder. Jack had witnessed the entire exchange from the porch, phone in hand, recording everything. "That's assault on video. Your assault. He can use it." Ethan's hand still shook. "Let him try. Sophie, baby, come here." She crossed the porch into his arms, and he held her tight, feeling her small heartbeat against his chest. Boss scared them, didn't he? Sometimes standing up to bullies looks scary, yeah. But it's necessary. You understand that? She nodded against his shoulder. "Like in your cowboy movies. The good guys don't run from bad guys. Exactly like that, baby. Exactly like that." The evening brought messages from Jack's contacts. 2 more potential witnesses had gone silent. One moved out of state overnight. Another claimed sudden memory problems regarding his employment at Whitmore Development. The intimidation campaign was accelerating, resources deploying to contain the threat before Ethan could make it official. Jack mapped the suppression efforts on a whiteboard in the study, tracking who'd been contacted, what pressure they'd faced, which testimonies remained viable. The network of fear that had protected Senator Whitmore for decades was activating to crush exposure before it metastasized beyond control. Kenny Wilson finally called on day 29, his voice gravelly with age and resignation. "I can't testify." They visited my daughter in Denver, mentioned her kids, how unfortunate accidents happen when people make wrong choices. "I'm 71 years old. I did things I'm not proud of because I needed work, but I can't risk my grandchildren." "I'm sorry." Jack's response came gentle. "Kenny, I understand. Family comes first. But know this, what you saw, what you know, it matters. If you change your mind, we'll protect you. Federal witness protection, relocation, new identities if necessary." Think about it. After the call disconnected, Jack sat silent for long minutes before speaking. This is what evil looks like in practice. Not monsters, not cartoon villains, just people making calculations, choosing safety over conscience, protecting theirs at the cost of everyone else's. Thomas fought that for 10 years and lost. We might lose too, but at least we're fighting. The laptop pinged with encrypted email. Sarah Bennett responding to Jack's preliminary case summary with 3 words that changed at everything. Warrants approved. Excavation authorized. Jack read the full message aloud. Federal authorization granted for forensic excavation at 3 construction sites based on preliminary evidence review. Ground penetrating radar scheduled. Excavation teams on standby. Process begins in 10 days. Need both of you safe until evidence secured and indictments prepared. Recommend immediate protective custody. 10 days. In 10 days, highways and bridges and foundations would be torn open, bodies would be recovered, DNA would confirm identities, and Senator Marcus Whitmore's carefully constructed empire would begin collapsing under the weight of truth it had buried. Ethan's phone buzzed, number unlisted, voicemail arriving without ring. "Mr. Cross, this is your final warning. Walk away, take your daughter, and disappear. Because what happens next, you brought on yourself." The threat was clear, timeline obvious. They knew about the excavation warrants or suspected them, knew they had days to eliminate the problem before evidence became irrefutable. Jack recognized the same calculus. They'll move soon. Tonight, tomorrow night. Can't wait for official action. We need to prepare defenses or evacuate now. Evacuate meant leaving the ranch undefended, possibly torched, certainly destroyed. Defend meant risking Sophie in a confrontation that could turn violent. The choice was impossible until Sophie herself made it simple, her voice carrying from her bedroom where she was supposed to be sleeping. "Bah, are we leaving?" "What did you hear, baby?" Enough. Her small shape appeared in the study doorway, silhouetted by nightlight glow. "This is our home. Ong wanted us here. I don't want to run." Jack started to object, but Ethan raised a hand. "If we defend, what does that look like?" Jack's military training showed in his assessment. Secure the house, establish fallback positions, arm ourselves, monitor approaches, call law enforcement at first contact. Odds aren't great, but we make it costly enough they reconsider. Ethan looked at his daughter, at the home they'd rebuilt through sweat and determination, at 23 yellow pins marking faces that deserve justice. We defend. But Sophie evacuates at first sign of trouble. Non-negotiable. Jack nodded. I'll make preparations. The night passed in tense vigilance. Jack's tactical experience transformed the ranch into a defensible position. Motion sensors expanded, cameras repositioned for maximum coverage, firearms cleaned and loaded, ammunition inventoried, escape routes mapped and rehearsed. He showed Ethan how to hold the rifle properly, sight picture, trigger squeeze, treating every shot like it might be the one that mattered. The lesson felt surreal. 3 weeks ago, Ethan had been living in his truck, applying for construction jobs, trying to keep his daughter fed. Now he was learning combat marksmanship to defend a home against people willing to commit murder to protect their secrets. Sophie spent the day helping Jack organize emergency supplies, backpacks with food, water, first aid, cash, copies of critical documents. She approached the preparations with 8-year-old seriousness that suggested she understood more than they'd told her. When Jack explained the tunnel Thomas had built beneath the barn, old storm shelter expanded into escape route, she insisted on practicing the evacuation twice until she could navigate it without help. The attack came 40 hours after Reeves's ultimatum, deep in Montana night when darkness was absolute and sound carried for miles. Motion sensors triggered at 11:37 p.m., multiple contacts, coordinated approach from 3 directions. Laptop screens showed thermal signatures converging on the house, 6 figures in tactical formation that spoke of military training and serious intent. Jack's voice came urgent and controlled. Wake Sophie, grab the go bags, move to the tunnel. I'll hold them here. Buy time. Ethan was already moving, scooping Sophie from sleep, wrapping her in the blanket she'd been clutching. Come on, baby. Remember the drill. We're going to the barn now, just like we practiced. Her arms circled his neck, voice muzzy with interrupted dreams. The bad men came? Yeah, baby. But we're ready. You're safe. Bah promises. The back door opened onto Montana night, stars brilliant overhead, temperature dropping toward frost, air so clear it burned lungs. Ethan ran across open ground toward the barn, Sophie a solid weight against his chest, go bag heavy on his back. Behind them, glass shattered, front windows breaking as entry began. Jack's rifle spoke once, twice, sharp cracks that echoed across grassland and sent adrenaline spiking through Ethan's bloodstream. The barn's false floor panel lifted easily, revealing the tunnel entrance Thomas had excavated decades ago with paranoia that now seemed justified. Ladder descended 15 feet to packed earth tunnel, emergency lights casting weak illumination. Sophie climbed down first, nimble and quick, while Ethan listened to the firefight escalating at the house. More shots, different calibers, someone shouting orders. Jack was outnumbered, but using defensive position effectively, making attackers pay for every approach. Ethan dropped into the tunnel, pulled the panel closed above, started crawling. The tunnel stretched 200 yards, barely wide enough for shoulders, rough-hewn walls showing marks of Thomas's shovel work. Sophie moved ahead, small body perfect for the confined space, while Ethan scrambled after her with pack scraping, ceiling, and knees bruising on stone. The tunnel terminated in another vertical shaft, ladder leading up to hidden exit in the tree line. Sophie climbed first, Ethan boosting her higher when her arms tired. They emerged into wilderness, air cold and clean, stars overhead seeming to spin. Behind them, muzzle flashes visible at the house. Jack still fighting. Jack's truck sat where he'd positioned it that morning, keys under the driver's mat. Ethan strapped Sophie into the back seat, started the engine, lights off, transmission in gear. The sound of his own heartbeat competed with distant gunfires. He waited, every second an eternity, hoping Jack would appear. Thermal scopes swept the tree line. Someone from the house searching for escapees. Ethan ducked low, killed the engine, made himself invisible. Sophie's breathing came fast and scared. Where's Mr. Jack? He's coming, baby. He promised. The words felt like prayer. Movement in the trees, Jack running hard, rifle slung across his back, limping but fast. Ethan restarted the engine, popped the door. Jack dove into the passenger seat, bleeding from his shoulder, face grim. Drive. North. Don't stop for anything. The truck launched forward, tires finding purchase on forest floor, bouncing over terrain that threatened to shake them apart. Shots cracked behind them, muzzle flashes in the darkness, bullets punching through tailgate but missing occupants. Ethan drove by instinct. No headlights, using starlight in memory of terrain Jack had made him memorize. The truck crashed through brush, splashed across a shallow creek, emerged onto access road doing 40 miles per hour. Sophie's voice came small from the back seat. "Bah, why are people shooting at us?" The question deserved honesty. "Because we found out bad things they did, and they're scared we'll tell. But we're safe now, baby. We're going somewhere they can't follow." Jack pressed a hand against his shoulder, blood seeping between fingers. "Graze, clean through. I'm fine. Keep driving." The headlights came on once they hit highway, civilization resuming around them like surfacing from deep water. Ethan pushed the truck to 80, watching mirrors for pursuit that never materialized. They'd committed attempted murder of federal witnesses, but following meant confirming involvement, leaving witnesses alive to identify them. Better to retreat, destroy evidence of their presence, and hope Ethan and Jack couldn't prove what had happened. The drive to Portland took 9 hours through mountain darkness and high desert dawn, stopping once for gas and first aid supplies at a 24-hour truck stop. Jack cleaned his wound in a bathroom that smelled of diesel and desperation, emerged with shoulder bandaged and color returning to his face. Sophie slept in the back seat wrapped in emergency blankets, exhausted beyond fear, trusting her father to deliver on promises of safety. They reached Portland as morning rush hour began, city noise and traffic feeling alien after weeks of Montana isolation. Jack directed them to a secure apartment owned by a former colleague, empty space that served as safe house for agents who needed to disappear. The address didn't exist in public records. The building superintendent had been FBI before retirement. The windows were bulletproof, the door reinforced, the phone lines encrypted. Sophie woke disoriented, confused by urban sounds after country silence. "Where are we?" "Somewhere safe, baby." Ethan carried her inside, found a bedroom, tucked her into bed despite the morning hour. "Rest. When you wake up, we'll get breakfast, and I'll explain everything." She was asleep before he finished the sentence, exhaustion claiming her completely. Jack made coffee in the apartment's sterile kitchen, hands shaking slightly from blood loss and adrenaline crash. "Called Sarah from the truck while you were watching the road. She's meeting us this afternoon. Federal marshals are securing the ranch, what's left of it, and collecting evidence. They found shell casings, blood, signs of forced entry. Combined with our testimony and security footage, that's attempted murder federal witnesses. Adds to the charges. What about the house?" The question came quiet, already knowing the answer. Jack's silence was answer enough. Then, "Some things can be rebuilt, Ethan. Some things matter more than structures." Ethan thought about Sophie's drawings on the walls, about the rocker Rose had loved, about Thomas's study with 23 yellow pins marking lives taken. The ranch had been home for 4 weeks. It had been waiting for 20 years. And now it was a crime scene, evidence of conspiracy's desperation, proof that truth threatened people willing to burn it all down rather than face accountability. The meeting with Sarah Bennett happened at 3 p.m. in a conference room at the federal building, windows overlooking the Willamette River, security so tight they'd pass through 3 checkpoints and a metal detector. Sarah herself matched Jack's description, mid-40s, sharp-eyed, wearing exhaustion like a badge from cases that never slept. She listened to their account without interruption, taking notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions that showed prosecutorial mind assembling narrative into evidence structure. When they finished, she slid a folder across the table. Excavation began this morning at Highway 89 site. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed anomalies consistent with human remains. Dig crews found 3 bodies in the first 4 hours, all showing signs of trauma, all buried in excavation fill before asphalt was poured. Forensics is processing for DNA, but preliminary work suggests these are Jenny Martinez, Kyle Thompson, and Sarah Winters. 3 of the 23 your grandfather identified. The words hit Ethan with unexpected force. Thomas had been right. Every supposition, every connection, every terrible conclusion he'd drawn from patterns in research and determination, right. The validation came decades late, but it came. Sarah continued, "With bodies recovered and your testimony, we have grounds for immediate arrests. Senator Whitmore, Sheriff Tucker, Judge Crawford, Daniel Reeves, and 15 others named in your evidence. Federal marshals are preparing coordinated raids across Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. Execution is set for dawn tomorrow. By the time breakfast news airs, Montana's political landscape will have changed permanently." Jack leaned forward. "Witness protection for Ethan and Sophie already arranged. New identities, relocation, financial support until trials conclude. They'll be safe. You have my word." She looked at Ethan directly. "Your grandfather spent a decade building this case. You spent 4 weeks finishing what he started. 23 families are getting answers they've waited years to receive. That's worth something. That's worth everything." The hotel room that night, federal protection, guards outside, Sophie sleeping in the next bed, felt simultaneously secure and temporary. Tomorrow the arrest would happen. Tomorrow the world would learn what Senator Marcus Whitmore had done. Tomorrow started the long process of trials and testimony and justice delivered through legal mechanisms that Thomas Brennan had trusted would eventually function if given enough truth to work with. Ethan stood at the window watching Portland lights spread toward distant darkness. Somewhere in Montana, a ranch house stood damaged but not destroyed, evidence of attack proving conspiracy's willingness to murder. Somewhere in courtrooms and jails, powerful people would learn that authority ended where accountability began. Somewhere in the dark, 23 families were about to receive phone calls explaining that their missing loved ones had been found, that answers existed after years of silence, that someone had cared enough to look. Sophie stirred in her sleep, murmuring words he couldn't distinguish. 8 years old, and already she'd lived through divorce, homelessness, reconstruction, and violence. But she'd also learned that home meant something worth fighting for, that evil could be named and confronted, that ordinary people possessed power that wealth and influence couldn't extinguish. Those lessons would serve her better than comfort ever could. Jack sat in the apartment's living room, shoulder bandaged, rifle cleaned, and ready despite being in federal custody. The old FBI agent had carried guilt for 20 years, watching the system fail Thomas Brennan and doing nothing effective to stop it. Tomorrow that debt would begin resolving into something that looked like justice. Not perfect, not complete, but real enough to matter. The city lights blurred as exhaustion claimed Ethan completely. Tomorrow would bring arrests, news coverage, the beginning of legal processes that would stretch for months. But tonight his daughter slept safe, and his grandfather's evidence had finally reached people with authority to act. Sometimes inheritance meant property. Sometimes it meant obligation. And sometimes it meant finishing another man's unfinished work, because legacy demanded completion regardless of personal cost. Thunder Ridge Ranch waited in Montana darkness, damaged but standing, home to ghosts who could finally rest knowing their sacrifice had mattered. The fight wasn't finished. Trials remained, testimony waited, justice would demand patience and persistence. But the war's first battle had been won through determination, evidence, and the simple refusal to accept that power equaled immunity from consequence. Ethan closed his eyes and saw Thomas's study, walls covered in evidence, yellow pins marking faces that deserved remembering. Tomorrow those faces would have names again. Tomorrow their families would grieve properly, finally, completely. And tomorrow a senator would learn that 30 years of silence could end in a single day, when truth found the right people at the right moment. Some debts can only be paid in courage and time. Thomas Brennan had given both. His grandson had added determination and the willingness to risk everything. And together, across 20 years and 400 miles, they'd built something that mattered more than safety or comfort or the tempting escape of $5 million. Justice. Delivered late, but delivered complete. The way it was always supposed to work when the system functioned as designed. The raids happened at dawn, across 3 states simultaneously, federal marshals executing warrants with precision that left no room for escape or evidence destruction. Senator Marcus Whitmore was arrested at his Helena mansion while eating breakfast, still wearing silk pajamas when they handcuffed him in front of news cameras his own communications director had summoned for a campaign photo opportunity. The irony was too perfect to be accidental. Sarah Bennett had timed the operation to maximize humiliation, understanding that public shame served justice better than private custody. Sheriff Raymond Tucker went down at his office, surrounded by deputies who watched their boss being read his rights with expressions ranging from shock to vindication. Some had suspected, most had looked away. All now understood that complicity had limits and federal authority didn't respect local loyalties when crimes crossed state lines and body counts. Judge Helen Crawford fought the arrest with legal objections that crumbled under the weight of 23 bodies in witness testimony. Her courtroom, where she dismissed cases and protected conspirators for decades, became the staging area for her own perp walk. Bailiffs she'd worked with for years, avoiding eye contact as marshals led her out in handcuffs. Daniel Reeves tried running, made it to the Bozeman airport before being tackled by agents who tracked his movements since the ranch attack. His expensive suit tore during the takedown, blood from a split lip staining his collar, the indignity complete when local news crews broadcast footage of Montana's most connected fixer face down on airport concrete. 15 others followed in coordinated sweeps: construction company executives, shell company officers, land development managers, the apparatus that had made murder profitable for 3 decades. The arrest dominated morning news cycles, cable networks interrupting programming for live coverage, anchors struggling to convey the scope of conspiracy that had operated in plain sight while law enforcement looked the other way or actively participated. Sophie watched the coverage from the safe house, curled on the couch with her bear, processing images of men in handcuffs with the gravity of someone who understood these were the people who'd shot at their home. Bah, they can't hurt us now, right? The question deserved certainty even if Ethan felt none. They're going to prison, baby. For a long time. We're safe. Jack's shoulder required surgery. Bullet had done more damage than he'd admitted. Infections setting in during the drive. Ethan visited him in recovery, found the old agent drugged but lucid, watching news coverage with satisfaction that didn't require words. Thomas Brennan's case had finally broken open, not through official channels, but through one man's refusal to stop documenting truth even when the system punished him for trying. The excavation results arrived in stages over the following week. Highway 89 yielded 5 bodies instead of 3, construction having layered victims over multiple years. The Clearwater Bridge site revealed 4 more, concrete jackhammers exposing remains that forensics carefully extracted and photographed. A shopping center foundation gave up 3 victims who'd been missing since the 1990s, their families having spent decades believing they'd run away to cities and new lives. DNA identification took longer, but eventually matched all 12 recovered bodies to names from Thomas's list. Jenny Martinez, Kyle Thompson, Sarah Winters, the 3 Sarah Bennett had mentioned, plus 9 others: Michael Chen, Patricia Blackwood, James Running Bear, Angela Herrera, David Moss, Kimberly Foster, Raymond Tall Elk, Crystal Winters, Thomas Lee. Young people 18 to 25, each with families who'd never stopped wondering, never stopped hoping against hope that someday they'd get answers. The phone calls to those families happened over 2 terrible days, federal agents delivering news that brought simultaneous grief and relief. Patricia Blackwood's mother collapsed hearing her daughter had been found, had been murdered, would finally receive proper burial after 15 years of unknowing. James Running Bear's father, a tribal elder who'd fought for investigation into his son's disappearance, wept on camera when told that evidence would finally bring prosecution and his boy could rest according to traditional ceremonies. The media coverage shifted from sensational arrests to human tragedy, networks running profiles of victims that transformed them from statistics into people with dreams and families and futures that had been stolen. Sophie watched one profile: Angela Herrera, 19, aspiring veterinarian who disappeared walking home from her job at a Billings animal clinic, and asked questions Ethan struggled to answer. Why would anyone hurt her? She just wanted to help animals. Because some people care more about money and power than human life, baby. Because they thought they could get away with it. But they couldn't. Young made sure of that. The grand jury indictments came down 3 weeks after the arrests. Senator Marcus Whitmore faced 47 charges, including 12 counts of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, corruption of public officials, and obstruction of justice. Sheriff Tucker got 38 counts. Judge Crawford received 31. Daniel Reeves was charged with attempted murder of federal witnesses, plus conspiracy charges linking him to the broader operation. The other defendants faced varying charges depending on their roles, but even the lowest-level participants looked at decades in federal prison. Sarah Bennett held a press conference explaining the case. This conspiracy operated for 30 years because people in positions of authority chose profit over duty. They weaponized the legal system against anyone who threatened their operations. They murdered young people and buried evidence under infrastructure projects. They thought power made them immune. But one man, Thomas Brennan, a Montana rancher, spent 10 years documenting their crimes. When they silenced him by destroying his family, he preserved that evidence and waited. 20 years later, his grandson finished what he started. That's how justice works when ordinary people refuse to accept that evil can operate with impunity. The trials began in late summer, federal courthouse in Helena becoming the center of national attention. Ethan and Sophie remained in protective custody, different safe house, different city, marshals rotating to prevent pattern recognition. The isolation wore on Sophie, who missed school and friends and normalcy. She adapted by creating detailed drawings of the ranch, showing it not as they'd left it, but as she imagined it could become. Repaired, beautiful. Home. Jack recovered from surgery, but carried the shoulder wound as permanent reminder. He spent recovery time organizing evidence with the obsessive precision of someone who'd failed once and refused to fail again. Every document cross-referenced, every witness statement corroborated, every timeline verified against multiple sources. The prosecution's case was already strong. Jack made it unassailable. The trial of Senator Marcus Whitmore opened on September 12th before a jury that had been vetted extensively to ensure no connections to Montana's political establishment. The prosecution presented evidence methodically. Thomas's original investigation, forensic proof that bodies matched victims, construction records showing Whitmore Development's involvement, witness testimony from former employees who'd seen too much and been paid to forget. Financial records traced money from shell companies to Whitmore's personal accounts. Surveillance footage showed vehicles registered to his companies at Thomas's ranch the night of the attack. Ethan was called to testify on the trial's 8th day. Sophie left in a courthouse waiting room under marshal protection while he took the stand and placed his hand on a Bible that felt heavier than it should. The courtroom packed with journalists, victims' families, curious public who'd followed coverage. Senator Whitmore sat at the defense table in an expensive suit that couldn't hide the reality of his situation, watching Ethan with calculation that suggested he was measuring his grandson's grandson and finding him wanting. Sarah Bennett's questions came structured to build narrative. Mr. Cross, how did you come to possess your grandfather's investigation? The answer required explaining the inheritance, the locked study, the notebooks that documented a decade of careful observation. Ethan kept his voice steady, focusing on facts rather than emotion, letting the evidence speak through his testimony. When Sarah asked about his own discoveries, the construction burial method, the cross-reference databases Thomas couldn't access, he walked the jury through the analysis step by step, showing how digital tools had completed work his grandfather began with paper and determination. The defense attorney's cross-examination attempted to paint Ethan as unreliable, a desperate, broke man whose financial situation made him susceptible to fabricating evidence for attention or revenge. The attack fell flat against documentary proof and forensic evidence, but the lawyer pushed anyway. Isn't it true you were living in your truck when you received notice of the inheritance? Yes, Ethan kept his voice level. And isn't it true you'd been unemployed for months? Yes, so you had significant financial motivation to create a narrative that would generate publicity, book deals, media attention. I had motivation to finish what my grandfather started, to get justice for 23 people who were murdered, to prevent more deaths by exposing criminals who'd been operating for 30 years. The money Senator Whitmore offered me to stay silent was $5 million. I refused it. So no, financial motivation didn't drive my actions. The courtroom rippled with reaction. The $5 million offer hadn't been public knowledge. Sarah Bennett had saved that revelation for trial, letting it come naturally through testimony rather than press releases. The jury's expression shifted, calculation replaced by attention, skepticism by engagement. When the defense finished, Sarah asked one final question. Mr. Cross, your grandfather sacrificed his relationship with you to preserve evidence that would eventually prosecute these crimes. He never saw justice delivered. What would you want him to know if he were here today? Objection. Calls for speculation. The defense attorney stood quickly, withdrawn. Sarah smiled slightly, knowing the question had achieved its purpose, reminding the jury that Thomas Brennan had paid personally for pursuing truth. Ethan left the stand after 2 hours of testimony, found Sophie coloring in the waiting room, let her hug drive away the tension of confronting his family's destroyer. The marshals escorted them toward the exit, navigating courthouse hallways that smelled of marble and consequence. Then Ethan saw him. Senator Marcus Whitmore stood 50 feet away, flanked by attorneys and marshals, waiting for an elevator. Their eyes met across polished floor and filtered sunlight. The senator's attorneys tried steering him away, but Whitmore shook them off, stepped forward, closing the distance until only 10 feet separated them. The hallway went silent. Marshals tensed, hands moving toward weapons, uncertain of protocols. Sophie pressed against Ethan's side. Whitmore's voice came low, controlled, venomous. You think this is victory? Destroying my career, my legacy, everything I built? You're nobody, Cross. A carpenter with a grudge. Your grandfather was a meddling old fool who couldn't leave well enough alone, and you're following the same path. 23 people. You know what they were? Acceptable losses, collateral damage in progress. Montana needed development, use, growth. I delivered that. What did they deliver? Nothing. They were nothing. The words hung like poison in sterile air. Ethan felt Sophie's small hand grip his tighter, felt every eye in the hallway watching, felt the temptation to violence rise and recognized it for what Whitmore wanted, a reaction, a mistake, anything to humanize himself and demonize his accuser. Instead, Ethan's response came quiet, certain, final. You're right about one thing, Senator. I'm nobody, just a carpenter, just a broke, desperate man trying to do right by his daughter and honor his grandfather's memory. And that nobody, with no power, no money, no connections, still managed to expose you, still gathered enough evidence to convict you, still brought down your entire empire. You had everything, wealth, position, authority, and you lost to someone with nothing but determination and truth. That should terrify you more than any prison sentence, because it means you were never as powerful as you thought. It means ordinary people can beat extraordinary evil when they refuse to quit. And that precedent, that example, it'll outlive both of us. Whitmore's face twisted with rage, but his attorneys pulled him back, whispered urgent warnings, steered him into the elevator. The doors closed on his furious expression. The hallway exhaled collectively. Sophie looked up at Ethan. Ba said exactly what Ong would have said. The observation landed with weight Ethan felt physically. Maybe he had. Maybe Thomas's courage lived in more than evidence and notebooks. Maybe it lived in the willingness to stand before power and refuse to flinch. The satellite trials, Daniel Reeves, the construction executives, the shell company officers, produced similar results over the following months. Federal prosecutors offered plea deals to lower-level participants in exchange for testimony against leadership. 4 accepted, turning state's evidence, providing details about operations that filled gaps in Thomas's investigation. 19 refused and went to trial, where juries convicted them based on evidence that had been preserved for 2 decades waiting for this moment. The verdicts came after 3 weeks of testimony, jury deliberating for less than 6 hours before reaching unanimous decision. The court clerk read charges one by one, guilty following guilty in rhythm that sounded like drum beats or heartbeats or the inexorable grinding of justice finally functioning. Guilty of murder in the first degree, 12 counts. Guilty of conspiracy. Guilty of racketeering. Guilty of corruption. Guilty on all 47 charges. Senator Marcus Whitmore showed no reaction, face frozen in expression that might have been shock or defiance or the awful realization that power's protection had limits. Sheriff Tucker wept openly. Judge Crawford sat rigid, refusing to acknowledge the verdict's reality, even as it destroyed her. The sentencing hearing happened on a January morning when Montana wind howled outside the courthouse and snow fell in sheets that made visibility impossible. Inside, warmth and light and the business of allocating consequences. Judge Morrison, federal appointee from Wyoming with no Montana connections, presided with gravity appropriate to crimes that had destroyed families across multiple states. The victim impact statements began at 9 a.m. and continued for hours. Patricia Blackwood's mother spoke of 15 years wondering where her daughter was, imagining scenarios ranging from trafficking to voluntary disappearance, never suspecting murder, because who murders a 20-year-old nursing student walking home from her shift? The not knowing had been its own torture, relationships destroyed by grief that couldn't resolve, holidays marked by absence that grew heavier with each passing year. Her voice broke, describing the call from federal agents, the simultaneous relief and devastation of finally knowing, the anger at 20 wasted years of hope when her daughter had been dead within hours of disappearing. James Running Bear's father delivered his statement in English and then repeated it in his tribal language, words flowing with cadence that needed no translation to convey loss and pain, and finally, acknowledgement. The tribal community had suspected law enforcement involvement in his son's disappearance, but lacked proof or resources to investigate. Federal indifference to indigenous victims had been its own conspiracy, making them easy targets for criminals who understood that some lives mattered less to the system designed to protect everyone equally. He spoke of cultural ceremonies denied, of a spirit that couldn't rest properly, of healing delayed by decades of official dismissal. Angela Herrera's sister read a statement on behalf of their mother, who died 3 years earlier, never knowing her daughter's fate. Our mother spent her last years believing Angela had abandoned us, chosen a life somewhere else over family. That pain, believing her child had rejected her, killed her as surely as cancer did. Senator Whitmore didn't just murder my sister. He murdered my mother's peace, her final years, her memory of a daughter who loved her but never came home. There are victims beyond the ones buried under concrete, families destroyed by not knowing, communities broken by unanswered questions. He stole more than lives. He stole closure, healing, the ability to grieve properly. Michael Chen's brother spoke through tears about a 22-year-old engineering student who disappeared during spring break, whose parents had spent their retirement savings on private investigators and reward offers, who died believing their son was alive somewhere, unreachable but breathing. David Moss's father described a son with dreams of teaching, gone at 19, whose bedroom remained unchanged for 18 years because maybe, somehow, he'd walk back through that door. Kimberly Foster's twin sister explained what it meant to lose half of yourself, to spend every birthday and holiday with phantom pain from an absence that had no name until now. 12 families spoke, grief made public, pain given voice, absence acknowledged in ways that official systems had denied for decades. When they finished, Judge Morrison asked if the defendants wished to address the court before sentencing. Most declined. Senator Whitmore stood, ignoring his attorney's urgent whispers, and spoke words that revealed nothing resembling remorse. I maintain my innocence. This prosecution is politically motivated, evidence fabricated, and my conviction will be overturned on appeal. History will vindicate me. Montana needed progress, and I delivered it. Everything I did served the greater good. The judge's expression never changed. Mr. Whitmore, the jury has spoken. 12 citizens heard evidence, evaluated testimony, and found you guilty beyond reasonable doubt. Your belief in your own innocence is irrelevant to the reality of your crimes. Your claim of serving a greater good rings hollow when measured against 12 murdered young people and the families you destroyed. The court now proceeds to sentencing. The sentences accumulated like weight, years piling onto years, life without parole for each murder count, 12 consecutive life sentences guaranteeing Whitmore would die in federal custody, additional decades for conspiracy, racketeering, corruption. The total exceeded 300 years, symbolic since one life was all he could serve, but meaningful in demonstrating the scope of his crimes and the certainty he would never walk free. Sheriff Tucker received 85 years. Judge Crawford got 60. Daniel Reeves was sentenced to 40 for attempted murder and conspiracy. The construction executives and shell company officers received terms ranging from 15 to 50 years depending on their involvement. When Judge Morrison finished, 23 convicted criminals faced federal imprisonment. Conspiracy shattered. Decades of unpunished crime finally meeting consequence. Sophie watched the sentencing on closed-circuit television from a secure room. federal marshals having decided 8-year-olds shouldn't sit in courtrooms hearing detailed descriptions of murder. When it concluded, she looked at Ethan with an expression that seemed too old for her face. Did we win, Ba? The question required nuance. We got justice. That's different from winning. Those families still lost people they loved. We still lost 20 years with Ong and Ba. But the bad people can't hurt anyone else now. So yeah, baby, we won what could be won. The return to Thunder Ridge Ranch happened in March when Montana winter was surrendering to spring and the land was remembering how to be green. Federal investigators had released the property after documenting everything, collecting evidence, processing the crime scene that the attack had created. The house bore scars, bullet holes patched but visible, windows replaced, bloodstains on the porch scrubbed away but haunting. The study remained intact, Thomas's evidence having been removed for trials, but the space itself preserved as testament to one man's determination. Jack met them at the property line, shoulder healed but stiff, face showing relief at seeing them return. He'd spent the winter securing the structures, hiring contractors to complete repairs that fire and abandonment had necessitated. The house was livable now, roof sound, windows intact, plumbing functional, heat working. Not beautiful yet, but home again. Sophie ran through rooms that had become familiar through absence, checking her drawings against reality, finding things mostly as remembered. Her bedroom had been repainted, pale yellow instead of institutional white, with new furniture that Jack had built himself. A desk for homework, shelves for books, space for an 8-year-old to imagine futures beyond courtrooms and safe houses and men with guns. The transformation happened gradually over the following months. Ethan took construction jobs in Clearwater, his reputation as Thomas Brennan's grandson opening doors that bankruptcy and unemployment had closed. The work was good, framing houses, building additions, renovations that used skills he'd honed over 15 years. Sophie enrolled in local school, made friends with children who knew her story but treated her normally, adapted to rural Montana life with the resilience kids displayed when adults gave them stability and honesty. The ranch evolved beyond simple residence. Jack suggested it first, standing in Thomas's study one evening. This room, this work, can't let it just sit here. Tom built something important. Should be preserved, shared, used to help others. The idea crystallized over months of planning. The Thomas and Rose Brennan Justice Center opened 18 months after the final sentencing, nonprofit organization dedicated to investigating cold cases, supporting families of missing persons, and training citizens to recognize and report suspicious activity. The main house became offices for investigators, case managers, family liaisons, and administrative staff. Thomas's study was preserved as museum exhibit, walls still covered in evidence that had taken down a senator and exposed 30 years of conspiracy. The barn, repaired and reinforced, transformed into training facility where Jack taught workshops on evidence collection, legal procedures, and protecting yourself when powerful people wanted silence. Funding came from grants, private donors, and settlement money from a wrongful death lawsuit Ethan filed against Whitmore Development after assets were seized. $5 million, the amount Reeves had offered as bribe, distributed to victims' families after legal fees. Enough remained to endow the center, ensuring it would operate regardless of economic conditions or political climates. Sophie enrolled in local school, made friends who knew her story but treated her normally. She became the center's youngest volunteer, helping families navigate bureaucratic systems, organizing evidence, learning skills that would serve her regardless of future choices. Jack aged into the role of elder statesman, maintaining connections with federal law enforcement that ensured the center's investigations received appropriate attention. His shoulder never fully healed, remaining a reminder of the night when everything changed. In its first 3 years, the center investigated 17 cold cases across Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. 3 were solved through persistent investigation that official channels had abandoned. The first success came 14 months after opening, a missing person case from Bozeman that local police had classified as voluntary disappearance. The center's investigators found witnesses police had never interviewed, discovered financial records suggesting foul play, pushed prosecutors to reopen the investigation. The victims' remains were recovered from a remote property. DNA evidence identified the killer. Conviction followed. A family that had waited 8 years finally got answers. The second case involved a young woman who disappeared from a Billings shopping mall in 2010. Security footage existed but had never been properly analyzed. The center's team used facial recognition technology unavailable to the original investigators, identified the abductor, traced his movements through cell tower records, found the burial site. Another family received closure. Another killer faced justice. These weren't Thomas Brennan's cases. These were new injustices the center could address because one man's determination 20 years earlier had proven that ordinary citizens could achieve what official systems sometimes failed to accomplish. The center became model for similar operations in other states, proof that justice didn't require massive budgets or government backing, just competent investigators who refused to accept that some crimes were too old or too difficult to solve. Ethan stood on the porch one evening 3 years after returning, watching sunset paint grassland in shades of amber and gold that made him understand why Thomas had chosen this place and Rose had loved it enough to stay through abandonment and grief. The bullet holes in the siding had been filled and painted over, barely visible unless you knew where to look. The windows reflected sky without bloodstains or memories of violence. Inside, staff worked late on case files. In the barn, a training session was wrapping up. The center's phone rang with another family calling about a missing loved one, another chance to prove that justice worked when someone cared enough to push. Sophie appeared beside him carrying homework and determination. Mrs. Peterson asked if I'd present at school assembly about the center, about what we do. Should I? That means talking about Ong, about the murders, about everything that happened. You comfortable with that? She considered the question with seriousness beyond her years. People should know that ordinary people can fight back when the system fails. That's what you taught me. That's what Ong taught everyone. So yeah, I'll do it. The pride that hit was physical, chest tightening, throat closing recognition that his daughter had absorbed lessons that mattered more than comfort or conventional success. She understood that legacy meant responsibility, that privilege, even tragic privilege, created obligation to serve others. Jack joined them, coffee in hand, observing the ranch that had become his redemption. 23 families got closure because Tom refused to quit. 17 more got answers because you finished his work. 3 more because of the center. That's legacy. That's what happens when good people refuse to accept that power equals immunity. Thomas Brennan had built the foundation. Ethan had completed the structure. Now others were doing the work, expanding the mission, helping families, exposing crimes that powerful people wanted buried. The cycle continued, grief transforming into action, loss becoming motivation, pain channeling toward justice that might not heal wounds, but acknowledge them. Sometimes the debts we owe can't be paid to those who earn them. Thomas was gone 20 years before Ethan understood what he'd sacrificed, before the evidence and effort and determination proved their worth. Rose had died without seeing her grandson return, without knowing that preservation and patience and hope had been justified. But Sophie lived in the house they'd maintained. Families received closure because Thomas had documented truth. Criminals faced justice because one man refused to let power erase accountability. The Montana wind carried sage and distance and possibility. The ranch stood solid and purposeful beneath darkening sky. The center's work continued despite the hour. Lights burning in offices where investigators reviewed cold cases, voices drifting from the barn where Jack was explaining evidence chains to a new group of citizens learning to hold authorities accountable. Some inheritances measured in money or property, others measured in courage, truth, and the refusal to accept that evil could operate without resistance. Ethan Cross had inherited the fight his grandfather couldn't finish. He completed it through determination and risk and the willingness to sacrifice comfort for justice. Now he was passing that inheritance forward, to Sophie, to the center staff, to families who needed someone to believe them when official systems looked away. The work would continue long after he was gone, carried by people who'd learned that ordinary meant capable, that powerless meant underestimated, that one person with evidence and courage could topple empires built on corruption. The stars emerged over Montana grassland, brilliant in darkness that felt protective rather than threatening. Sophie went inside to finish homework. Jack headed to the study to review tomorrow's case files. And Ethan remained on the porch his grandfather had built, watching nights settle over land that remembered everything: tragedy and determination, loss and victory, the price of silence and the power of truth finally spoken. Thunder Ridge Ranch had become more than property or shelter. It was testament to the principle that justice delayed could still be justice delivered, that evil's protection had limits, that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power when they cared enough to wield it. 23 yellow pins on a map had become 23 families with answers. 17 more cases had joined them. The work wasn't finished. The fight wasn't over. But the precedent was established, the model proven, the legacy secured. Some stories end, others transform into missions that outlive their protagonists. Thomas Brennan's story had become Ethan's, which was becoming Sophie's, which would become countless others as the center's work expanded and its impact rippled outward. That was the true inheritance, not the ranch or the evidence or even the justice obtained, but the understanding that citizenship meant more than voting and complaining, that ordinary people could investigate and document and expose when they refused to accept official assurances that nothing could be done. The wind shifted, carrying hints of coming rain. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new families, new opportunities to honor Thomas and Rose by continuing the work they'd started in a room locked with love and preserved with hope. Tonight, daughter slept safe, friend worked fulfilled, ranch stood restored, and grandson kept watch over legacy that would endure. The fight was won, the work continued, and the inheritance, measured not in acres but in courage, not in dollars but in determination, not in property but in purpose, passed forward into hands that would carry it further than Thomas could have imagined when he began documenting truth in a study that would wait 20 years to fulfill its destiny. Justice, legacy, home, 3 words that meant everything Thomas Brennan had died hoping to achieve, everything Ethan Cross had risked everything to complete, everything Thunder Ridge Ranch now represented to families across 3 states who finally understood that someone cared enough to look, to fight, to refuse silence. The stars wheeled overhead. The wind whispered through grassland. And on the porch of a Montana ranch house, a man who'd inherited impossible obligation and transformed it into enduring purpose stood watch over work that would never truly finish because injustice never truly stopped. But neither would the people determined to fight it.
Ach, jetzt kommt der Elbow. Er ist noch Elbow drin gewesen. Einer Main, auf jeden Fall. Ja. Schade, Mann.
Get it, Judge.
Nee, optisch ist das neue Bundle nicht so geil, tatsächlich. Das neue Bundle ist optisch gesehen eher so eine 6 von 10. Der Sound ist halt ziemlich cool, aber das war's auch schon. Mich stört, dass diese Vanville keinen durchgehenden Schaft hat. Okay, noch 2 Runden jetzt. Auf geht's. Fokus.
Also wir brauchen echt jemanden, der schnell B smoken kann.
Ja, dann
Das heißt,
stelle ich mich lieber mit Tunnel,
muss jemand
oder?
B stehen.
Oder
Es
wieso
muss jemand
spielt
mit B
einer.
stehen, ja?
Kannst du auch hier spielen, Joris? Smokes, und wenn die kommen, Flasche durch, oder? Probier das mal.
Kann ich auch sonst so machen.
Mach mal den Engel. Ich glaube, das ist das besser.
Exi, guckst du dann so ein bisschen mit Tunnel?
Es reicht, wenn wir hier zu zweit erstmal A sind, weil ich nehme sowieso am Main-Info. Also ihr könnt erstmal entspannen. Wenn ich selbst höre, dann sage ich eh schnell Bescheid.
Dogma.
Hier ist gar nichts, Main.